Kristen Jane Anderson has been featured on Oprah, and she is a popular speaker at colleges, women's and youth events, churches, and suicide prevention outreaches. She is a graduate of Moody Bible Institute and the founder of Reaching You Ministries. Kristen seeks to help those who are hurting, hopeless, lost, suicidal, or depressed. Would you join me in welcoming Kristen?
Thank you all. Thank you. Can they hear me? Can you hear me okay? I turned it on. It is on. Okay. Should I just use the handheld? You want it? Hello? Okay, I think you can hear me now. Hi. Well, I'm very excited to be here. I've never been to this part of Wisconsin. I actually live in Green Bay, Wisconsin now, so I'm kind of like one of you. But I've never been here, so anyway, I'm going to start out talking about my story from the beginning. I grew up about an hour north of Chicago. My parents were always married. I had an older brother and an older sister that were always pretty good to me. My parents got me everything I needed. They gave me most of what I wanted. I just had a really happy, joyful childhood. When I look back, I just smile because I had such a great childhood. But once I got into junior high, it was about around that time that I realized the world wasn't as great as I thought it was, and people weren't as genuine as I thought they were, and I really began to struggle with that. I also started to realize that homelessness was a real issue in the area that I lived, that sexual abuse was a real issue in the world, and that there were wars going on in the world. I had been pretty oblivious to that until I was in junior high, and that really, all of it burdened me. And I wanted to do something to try and make a difference in the world, so I started volunteering in our local homeless shelter every Friday night for about a year. And at the end of that year, I looked around, and it looked to me like homelessness was just as much of an issue, so I just went into high school focusing on myself, my family, and my friends, trying to make myself, my family, and my friends happy. And that seemed to work pretty good for the first couple years. Things were, again, moving pretty smoothly. I was on the soccer team. I had a lot of friends. My boyfriend was prom king, and I really didn't think life could get much better in a lot of ways. It was still harder as a teenager than it was as in my childhood, but I was struggling much less than I was about to. Very quickly and very unexpectedly, a lot of things started to go wrong. I lost my first friend in a car accident. I lost a second friend in a motorcycle accident. I lost a third friend because of suicide. And I was about to lose a fourth friend because of a brain tumor. And I just had no idea at all how to handle that. I never lost anybody before that at that point in my life. I just didn't know how to process any of it. And on top of that, I lost my grandmother. I was raped, and I was being stalked by two young men. And this all happened within about a year and a half's time. And I would believe things would get better. I would hope things would get better. But it seemed like just another thing would go wrong, another thing would happen, and I was losing hope. I was more and more discouraged. I was more and more broken. I was more and more empty. I didn't really know what to believe in or what to trust anymore. And I started smoking, I started drinking, I started skipping classes, I started skipping school altogether. My parents knew something was wrong with me. They took me to see doctors, and the doctors said it was stress and anxiety after everything that I dealt with. They didn't know that I had been raped or anything like that. They just knew about my friends and my grandmother. And I was spiraling down, actually, into a deep depression that I wasn't being treated for, that I wasn't even aware of. But I had very negative thoughts. I would think life sucks all the time. I started driving really recklessly. I would hope that my life would just somehow end, and I wouldn't have to feel the way that I felt on the inside anymore. And New Year's Eve of my senior year, I wanted to go out, and my parents weren't going to let me go out because it was, I was supposed to be grounded because I was skipping classes, but they were going to let me go out this one night. We went back and forth about what time I was going to be home. They told me they would let me come home a half an hour later than normal because it was New Year's Eve. And I left the house agreeing to that, but deciding that I wasn't actually going to come home at all that night. I went out with my friends. They picked me up from the pizza restaurant that I worked at for a couple hours that night, and I called my mom in the middle of the night to tell her I wasn't coming home, but I hung up before she could say anything. And I made a lot of good choices that night besides that one. I was the designated driver for my friends. I didn't drink myself. I felt like I made a lot of good choices. But when I came home at 10 o'clock in the morning, my parents were naturally beside themselves. They just didn't know what to think or feel or believe. My mom made a comment, "Kristen, we didn't know if you were dead in a ditch somewhere or what happened to you." So I felt really bad. And they did something, not knowing how bad I was doing, they did something to try to get my attention. They told me that my punishment was going to be material and social. The things that I gotten for Christmas, they were either going to give to somebody who would appreciate them, or they were going to return them. And I was going to be grounded until further notice. And that now doesn't seem like such a terrible punishment necessarily, but it was devastating to me at the time because I was very materialistic. I found a lot of my value in the way that I looked and the clothes and things that I had. And my friends were sort of my world. That's what my world revolved around, was my friends. So not knowing when I was going to get to hang out with them again was, it just was another thing on top of everything else. The next day, I actually slept that whole day because I had been up the whole night before, so I slept that whole day, and the next morning, I woke up and we went to church. And that's something we always did my whole life. We went to church on Sundays. I went to Sunday school. I went to youth group. I did all of that. But I went into church and I left church feeling exactly the same way, just really broken, hurt, empty, disillusioned, lost. And when we got home, my mom lay down on the couch to take a nap because she was so tired from waiting up for me the other night. My dad went to buy a new washer and dryer, and I decided to watch some Christmas videos of my little nephews opening presents just a few weeks earlier. I knew that that would probably cheer me up a little bit. They were really little at the time, and they were really excited opening their presents. So I watched the videos, and it did bring a little bit of joy to my heart. It put a smile on my face. And then my best friend called. My best friend's name was Kelly. We'd been friends since we were in 2nd grade. And she wanted me to come over to her house to make gingerbread houses. And I knew I wasn't supposed to be going anywhere. It was the last day of our Christmas break before we were supposed to go back to school, and I was grounded until further notice. And I told Kelly that, but Kelly and I didn't make the best decisions together, and we decided that I couldn't get in any worse trouble if I went. So I very dishonestly wrote a note to my parents saying that I was going for a walk. And my friend picked me up down the street. We went to her house. I was there for about 5 hours. We never ended up making gingerbread houses. Another friend dropped me off 5 hours later at the end of my street. Neither of them wanted to come to my house because they didn't want my mom to see them, knowing I shouldn't be going out. So I started walking home, and I just didn't feel like I could go home. I didn't feel like I had it in me. So I walked to the pizza restaurant that I'd been working at. I got my paycheck. I got a pack of cigarettes because I had been trying to use that to deal with how I was feeling on the inside. And I wasted time as best as I could. I just waited until I felt strong enough, basically, to go home. And it's not like I had a very unloving home or anything. My parents were amazing. They were very loving, very protective. I just didn't know how I could deal with them. I didn't know how I could deal with my life anymore. They were just a part of it. And so I started to walk home after about a half an hour. I knew they would be worried, and I had to go home. So I started to walk home, and it was almost like my legs wouldn't take me. I just didn't feel like I could do it yet. So I walked to the park that I grew up playing in. It was kitty corner across the street from my parents' house, and I started swinging on the swings. And as I started swinging on the swings, I started to contrast these happy childhood memories that I had with how I was feeling now as a teenager. And I just didn't know how to make sense of it. I didn't know how I could go from having such a happy, joyful, peaceful, sweet kind of childhood to having such a lost, confused, broken, empty teenage life. I didn't understand how to move forward. I didn't know how to move back. I felt like I was just going in circles and things were getting worse. So I was thinking about that when I remembered that you're not supposed to be in the park after dark. And it's just like a little rule they have in the small town that I grew up in for safety's sake. They want people out of the park after dark, and the police car will go in there to make sure nobody's in there. And I had seen them go in there before. I didn't want them to come see me and make me go home. I wanted a little more time to think, so I looked around to see where else I could go. And I saw there was a train that had been parked on the edge of the park for about 3 weeks. I had driven by, it hadn't moved at all, so I figured it wasn't going anywhere. And I decided to walk over to it and sit on it. And that's not really something I had ever done before. I never ventured that close to a train. But I did that just to get myself a little more time to think that night. And as I sat there, a thought process entered my mind that I'd had about 3 months beforehand. And it was as I was grieving through my friend Brandon's death. My friend Brandon is the one that I lost to suicide, and his death was certainly the hardest for me because I'd known him since preschool. And I just felt like there should have been something I could have done to help him. And I remember thinking as I was grieving through his death, I don't understand why he did that. Why did he do that? How could he do it the way he did it? And I thought, I could never do that. I could never take my life, especially the way that he did it. But then my thought process sort of changed. Well, even though I would never do it, how would I do it even if I would never do it? You know, especially if I would never do it the way he would do it, kind of thing. I was all over the place. And then I went through a number of different things in my mind that I'd heard about, read about, or seen on TV, and none of them seemed like they would necessarily work or be good enough. But then a train went by my parents' house, and it just snapped in my mind. That's one way I could never live through it. I could feel the power of the train shake our home. I could hear the whistle blare through the windows, and I just thought that's one way I could never live through it. I never thought about it again until 3 months later when I was sitting on the train that day. And that's when suicide entered my mind as an option or as an answer. I'd never really seriously thought about it before that moment. And I didn't know what to do. I knew deep down inside that it wasn't the answer, that it wasn't what I was supposed to be doing, but I didn't know what the right answer was. I wasn't really sure where else to turn or what else to do anymore. So it was very back and forth in my head. I would think there's a reason I'm here, and then I would think there's no reason I'm here. I would think there's something I'm supposed to do here, and then there's nothing I'm supposed to do here. I would think it's going to get better, and then I would think it's not going to get any better. And I was back and forth for about an hour and a half like that until a train started to come. And I hadn't made a decision. I didn't know what I was going to do or what I should do, but it was freezing cold out. It was January 2nd, so it was the middle of winter. It was about 8:30 at night. I could hear my breath. I only had these thin little black gloves on, and I knew I needed to go somewhere or do something. And right before the train got to me is when I made the impulsive decision to lay down on the tracks. I remember as I got off of the train I was sitting on, I just tried to push down the fear and the shame that I felt on the inside. And as I laid down, I closed my eyes, I clenched my fists, and I turned my head in the opposite direction than where the train was coming from. And I just tried to basically brace myself for what was about to come. And what I felt when the train first started to go over me is I felt it begin to suck me upward. I first felt my hair start to rise, then my shoulders, then the middle of my body, and then very quickly afterwards I felt something push me down and hold me down until the train came to a stop. It says in the police report that I was run over by 33 freight train cars at 55 miles per hour. And I really believe that that was God just very mercifully protecting my life and pushing me back down. I've had a number of train engineers and conductors tell me that because of how fast the train was going and how I was positioned beneath the train, I basically should have been torn to pieces, but I obviously wasn't torn to pieces. I really believe that he protected my life. And when the train came to a stop, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know if I was alive or dead. I really wasn't sure what had just happened. It happened really fast. So I started to open my eyes. I started to unclench my fists and look around. I really wanted to figure out if I was alive or dead. I just had no idea. So as I looked around, I looked behind me to my right. And behind me to my right, I saw my legs. And it was about 10 feet away they were about 10 feet away from me, and I knew they were my legs because they had these bright white tennis shoes on them that I had just gotten for Christmas. But it felt like a terrible nightmare. It felt like this could not be my life. This could not be what just happened. So I started to just gather myself. emotionally, I crawled out from underneath the train and I started to look down at my legs. I was just trying to assess the situation. I really wasn't sure if this was a bad dream. I just didn't know what to think. So I looked down at my left leg and I couldn't see anything there because it was dark out and it had been severed so high. So I turned my attention to my right leg, and it looked like it had been severed below the knee, but I'd never seen my leg like that before. I'd never even seen an amputated leg before. So I took my hand and I ran it below where it looked like it had been severed. And that's when I realized my legs were gone, because I saw the blood, the pain really hit me, and I started crying harder than I'd ever cried in my life before. I called for my mom the way that a small child would. I was just crying harder than I'd ever cried, in the worst pain I'd ever been in. And as that was happening, all of a sudden this tremendous peace started to cover me. And I started hearing the song Amazing Grace play over and over in my mind. And a lot of times people have asked me, was that a favorite song of yours? Did you hear it in church that morning? And neither are true. I just thought that could only be music from heaven. And I laid there hoping, praying, and waiting to die. As I was laying there hoping, waiting, and praying to die, all of a sudden I felt somebody pull my hair off my face and behind my ear. It says in the police report that the engineer said to the conductor, "Did you see that yellow flash?" And the conductor said to the engineer, "Yes, I think we just hit someone." The yellow flash that they saw was my bright yellow jacket that I was wearing that night as I laid down in front of the train. So they called 911, and the paramedics and the firefighters had went out looking for me. Now, the train was blocking the road that led to the park, so they had to walk the tracks to find me instead of drive into the park. And this firefighter was the first person to find me. He's the one who pulled my hair off my face and behind my ear. I wasn't expecting anybody to find me. I didn't really want anybody to find me. I didn't even hear him coming. So as he pulled my hair off my face and behind my ear, I looked at him kind of startled, and he stumbled back because he wasn't even expecting me to be alive. I sort of rose up on the inside because I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. I didn't really want anybody there. I didn't want help. I didn't want anybody to see me like that. I didn't want to be alive and face anybody who knew what I had just done. I just was not in a good place. So he radioed to the other medical personnel and staff of my location and my status. They got to me very quickly and determined that they wanted to flight for life me to the closest, well, the biggest hospital in Milwaukee. But they couldn't, in the end, flight for life me because it was very cold out that night and it was very foggy. So they did something that they've never done since, that wasn't protocol, that they had never done beforehand, and this was just that they blocked all the roads and the intersections from where I was to the closest hospital in the area that could take me. It says in the police report that it's normally a 45-minute drive, but that they got me there in 8 minutes. And when I got to the hospital, the nurses and the doctors were asking me what my name was, what my sister's name was, what her phone number was, what my parents' names were, what their phone number was. And they all started saying that they felt like they were witnessing a miracle because I, at that point, had lost 8 pints of blood. And scientifically, I found out that you're supposed to die after you lose 5. But I was still very much alive, talking, conscious, answering all of their questions. But I didn't feel like a miracle. I didn't really want to be a miracle. I wasn't grateful that I was still alive. I remember asking the doctor as he wheeled me into the operating room, "Do you think I'm going to live or die?" And he didn't answer my question one way or the other. He told me he didn't know. And he says that he told me he didn't know because he wanted me to go into surgery that night fighting to die, fighting to live. He just wanted me to go into surgery that night fighting. And I was in surgery all night long. They did a number of blood transfusions, and they were trying to reattach my legs, which is something they weren't successful at doing. And I woke up the next day in intensive care around 2:30 in the afternoon. And I remember when I first opened my eyes, all I saw was my mom, my dad, my sister, my brother, and my brother-in-law all in the room with their arms crossed and their heads looking down at the floor. And I didn't remember the events of the night before right away, so my first thought was, wow, something really bad must have just happened. But then the events started to flood back into my memory. My mom's eyes met with mine, and I just said, "Mom, they cut my clothes and they cut my coat." And she was like, "Honey, we can get you new ones. We're just glad you're okay." She ran to the side of my bed, and I fell back asleep because I was on a lot of medication. And then the next thing I remember was waking up and just being told by the doctor what my injuries were. And I understand why he was doing that, but I wasn't really ready for it. He told me that my left leg was severed well above the knee, that my right leg was severed directly below the knee, but that I might be able to walk with the use of prosthetic legs someday. And he was just trying to give me hope, but I wasn't ready for it. So I kind of ignored him. I didn't say bye. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say hi. I just stared out the window. He eventually left my room. The next thing that happened is I woke up. It had been several days, and I hadn't showered or anything, so I felt really gross. I had blood, sweat, and tears on me. I wanted to get cleaned up a little bit, so I asked my mom if I could call my friend Kelly to help me get cleaned up a little bit, and she said that would be fine. She dialed the phone for me. Kelly got on the phone, and she asked me how I was doing. I didn't know if she knew about what had happened to me. I figured I needed to tell her something because she was my best friend. But I wasn't really sure what to tell her, so I looked down at my legs to see if they were still gone. And it looked like they were. It looked like they probably weren't coming back, like this might not be just a really bad dream, a nightmare. It looked like this might seriously be my reality. So I said, I'm okay, but my legs are cut off. And tears just streamed down my face. And that's because that was the moment that became real to me. And she said, honey, you're going to be fine. You don't need your legs. You're going to be fine. And sometimes people think that's just so simple, so trite. How could she just say that? But it was exactly what I needed to hear. I needed to know that my best friend thought I would be fine with or without my legs. She thought I was going to be just fine. And in the coming weeks, months, all of my family and all of my friends just surrounded me and loved on me like crazy. And one of the things they told me over and over again was, Kristen, God kept you here for a reason. There's something you're supposed to do here. Kristen, God kept you here for a reason. There's something you're supposed to do here. I heard it so much that I almost got sick of it because I didn't know why I was here or what I was supposed to do here. But the very first weekend that we got out of the hospital, we went back to church, just like we always did on Sunday. And while I was there, a woman I had never met before who heard about what happened to me came up to me and told me that I would have went to hell if I died. And that wasn't something I was expecting to hear. That wasn't something I was welcoming to hear. But it really kind of sent me searching because everybody told me the feel-good answer. Oh, Kristen, of course you would have went to heaven. Don't worry about it. But everybody also said I should have died, and it was a miracle that I lived. So I wanted to know if I would have died, where I would have been right then. Would I have been in heaven? Would I have been in hell? I just wanted to know the truth. I wanted to know the answer, not what makes me feel good. So I started praying about it. I started kind of looking for answers, and very shortly afterwards, a couple that was friends with my sister and her family came to have dinner with our family just to encourage us after everything that we'd been through. And after we were done with dinner, I decided to ask the husband of this couple a very important question. I found out that he was in seminary to be a pastor, so I figured that he knew the Bible more than anybody else that I knew. And I asked him if he thought I would have went to heaven or hell if I died. And very lovingly, very sweet and patiently, he told me that every single one of us are created to be in a personal relationship with God. But because of our sin and because of the wrong things that we've done, we are separated from him, both in our relationship with him and eternally. And that is why Jesus died, to pay the penalty for our sins so we can be put back into a right relationship with him and so that we can spend eternity in heaven with him. But we have to choose to accept Jesus for the forgiveness of our sins, and we have to choose to let him lead our lives. And when he told me all of that, I just felt like what he was saying was more true than anything I'd ever heard in my life before. But I didn't want to just take his word for it. So I asked him to show me it in the Bible, and he showed me a lot of different verses. But the verse that stood out to me the most was John 14:6. And that's where Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And I just felt like Jesus could not have been more clear. No one comes to the Father but through me. And I knew that I had never made any sort of decision to accept Jesus' forgiveness in my life. I never chose to let him lead my life. I knew, especially at that point, that I had a lot to be forgiven for. And I also knew that something very special and important seemed to be missing from my life. So sitting on the floor in my parents' dining room, I just prayed the most simple little prayer. I asked God to forgive me for everything I had ever done wrong. I asked him to forgive me for even trying to take my own life. It was that night when I realized that my life wasn't mine to take, that God alone gives and takes life. And I asked him to give me a new life, to make me new. And as I went to sleep that night, I felt just a little bit different. I know that was the night that I became a Christian. I would have told you my whole life that I was a Christian before that, but I never had a relationship with God. I'd never made that decision. My eternity in heaven wasn't secure until that night. And when I went to sleep, I felt just a little bit different. It didn't solve my problems overnight or anything like that, but I felt like I didn't need to worry about my life so much anymore. Like it was going to be okay. Somehow it was all going to be okay. For the next several years, I was in counseling. I was struggling even worse than I had before my suicide attempt because my friends were moving on. They were going to college. They were accomplishing things. They were working, and I was going through surgeries. I was still living with my parents. It was just a really hard time for me. I wasn't walking on my prosthetics, and I wanted to believe that I could walk on prosthetics and my life would just go back to normal. So those things were very hard for me. I was in and out of the psych ward on the anniversary of my suicide attempt 3 or 4 times in those following years. But God was seriously at work even through those darkest moments. There was one woman at the community college I met who just shined with more peace and more joy and more love for life than anybody I had ever met before. And I remember after she talked about her life and her story a little bit, going home and just saying to God, I want to know you the way that lady knows you, because I didn't have that kind of a relationship with him. I didn't shine with peace and joy or love for life. I just didn't relate to him the way that she did at all. And what I felt him tell me was, Kristen, you have to let me be your best friend. And I just kind of felt that in my heart, and I thought about it. And I realized that at this point in my life, I had learned to go to other people for help. I was going to my friends and my family and my counselors and my doctors, but I wasn't going to him for help. And I realized that he was the one who created me. He was the one who knew me better than anyone else in this world. He was the one who knew my problems and the answers to them more than anyone else in this world. So really there was no reason for me not to start talking to him more. And I started to let him be my best friend. And the more that I walked towards him, the more I felt like I was walking straight out of my depression. The counselor that I had really helped me understand that I not only needed to forgive or accept God's forgiveness, but I needed to forgive myself. She had me memorize Romans 8:1, and that's where it says, therefore there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And the more that I memorized that, the more I realized that if God can forgive me, if he can forgive me for everything I've ever done wrong, past, present, and future, there's no reason for me not to forgive myself. I realized that I was only hurting myself. I was only holding back my life by not forgiving myself. And the more that I was able to forgive myself, the more freedom I found. Like I said, I found more peace, joy, love for life that I had always wanted, but I never had before. I started going to a new church, and I got off of all of my antidepressants and pain meds that my doctors told me I would have to take for the rest of my life. My mom started coming to church with me. She became a Christian. She started bringing my dad to church, this new church with her. He became a Christian. He brought my brother to church with him, and he became a Christian. So our whole family was being transformed, and it was a very amazing and sobering time because we always would have told you, like I said, that we were Christians. We really believed we were Christians, but we had no relationship with God. Our world did not involve him except on Sundays and maybe at meal times. So our whole lives changed when we surrendered our lives to him. It changed our family. It changed all our hearts. And I just always look back at that time with a huge smile on my face because I never imagined that God would use me and my family to help all of us. I just never imagined what I did that night could turn around in a positive way. But very shortly after all of that happened, I was asked to share my story with the high schoolers in the youth group at our church. And that wasn't something I was expecting. That wasn't something I was pursuing or even really interested in doing. I didn't like talking about my attempt at suicide very much, not with very many people at all. But when he asked me to do it, I told him I would think about it. I would pray about it. So I did that, and I started to realize that I didn't want anyone to have to learn this lesson the way that I did it. I didn't want anyone to have to lose their legs and basically be brought to their knees to realize how big and real and faithful God is, to realize that he is the God of the universe, that he loves them infinitely, that he will always be there. I wanted them to learn that lesson through my mistake instead of them ever making a similar mistake themselves. So I shared my story as vulnerably and openly as I could that night. And when I was done, almost every single one of the students came up to me and told me that they struggled with suicidal thoughts or depression, or they knew somebody who did. And that's when I realized that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was, that this was a much bigger issue than I had ever realized before. And I started to develop a burden just to help those people because they were just like me. And I realized that everyone struggles, and we all need help, we all need encouragement, we all need hope, we all need a reason to live, a reason to move on. So I started a ministry for people who struggle with suicidal thoughts and depression. It's called Reaching You Ministries, and I started getting asked to share my story other places after I shared it that first time, and I really always just thought it was one more time. And then another door would open, and another door would open, and another door would open. I would just always walk through those doors thinking maybe, one more person might be helped. Hopefully, we'll see what God does. And it was crazy because I just felt like I was seeing lives changed before my eyes. It was incredible. People were giving their lives to the Lord. They were letting go of their commitments to take their lives. They were choosing life instead. And I was just unbelievably amazed. I felt like a bystander of my life because it made sense to me that God would do what he did in my life and in my heart to help me, but I never, ever, ever expected that part of his reason for doing that was to help so many others. I ended up going to Moody Bible Institute in the middle of all of this because I knew I needed to really, really study the Bible if I was going to go into full-time ministry and start speaking on any type of regular basis. And while I was there, I got asked to share my story on the Oprah show. I don't know if you guys remember who she is. But obviously she had the biggest show in the world for a long time. And when they called, they asked me to share my story. They were planning a show with suicide survivors who were using their second chance at life to make a difference in the world. So they asked me if I would be a part of the show. They made me the guest in between the first and the last. I was right in the middle. And I agreed to do it one Wednesday. We taped the following Wednesday, and it aired the Wednesday after that. So it all happened very quickly. And I remember once it aired, how we just got thousands and thousands and thousands of emails through our ministry website from people who saw the show. But there was one email that stood out to me more than all the rest. It was written, the subject line was written in capital letters, and it was written by a young man who just wrote, "You saved my life." And it was hard and amazing for me to read that because I'd never just seen it in black and white like that before. People had told me things like that before, but I just never really let it sink in until I saw it in black and white, capital letters like that, and I just thought, oh my gosh, and I started to read this guy's story, and he said that he was planning to take his life the day that I was on the Oprah show. He was just waiting for his mom to leave for work, and after she left for work, he walked into the living room with a gun in his hand and went to turn the TV off when I was on the TV talking about my attempt at suicide and how God had forever changed my life since then, how I had found so much hope and peace and joy through Christ. He said that he got on his knees, he prayed to accept Jesus as his Lord and as his Savior that night, and I didn't know what was going to happen from then forward, but now he's a youth pastor leading other people to Christ and helping other students who are struggling, other young people. And I've just been so amazed by how all these things, all these details fit together, how God is in the smallest details of all of our lives more than we realize. It's just so amazing to see how he continues to be faithful. I ended up writing my story in a book because I was asked to share my story all over the world, places I could never go. And I decided to do it with an author who had an amazing story of her own. It took us about 2 years to write the book. It came out in hardcover in 2010. It came out in paperback in 2011. It's now in 8 languages. And the title of the book that it was originally and still has is Life in Spite of Me. And I just always like to share that because I didn't come up with it myself, but I can't think of a more fitting title because God has definitely given me life in spite of my sin, in spite of my mistakes, in spite of my shortcomings. He's given me life physically. He's given me life spiritually. He's given me life emotionally, and I will never be the same. My family will never be the same. Everything has changed, and it's just been a long process, but it's been an amazing process. It's been a great journey. I've learned to just take one day at a time, and as amazing as it's been to write a book and do media interviews and be, on the TV and whatever else, it is so much more amazing to know the God who created me, the God who made all of us, who knows us intimately, who hears our prayers, who can work in my heart in ways nobody else or nothing else in this world can. And I want to tell you just a little bit more in just to highlight how God has continued to be faithful. My parents say that this is what helped them realize that I really had come full circle. In 2011, I got married to an amazing Christian man who just loves me more like Christ than anybody I've ever met before. And in 2012, we had a little boy that we named Grayson. And we named him Grayson in honor of God's grace on my life. Grace is God's unmerited favor on us. It's when he gives us favor and we don't even deserve it. I know that I didn't deserve a second chance at my life that night, but he gave me grace. He gave me favor. He gave me another chance. And I got to experience and do so many more things than I ever imagined and I ever dreamed. And it hasn't all been easy, but it's been a great journey with him. And I am so looking forward to spending the rest of eternity in heaven with him and to seeing people whose lives I've been able to touch there who might not have been there if I hadn't talked about my story. I mean, it's just incredible to me. Knowing him is always going to be the most important thing in my life. And I can't really leave here tonight without asking anyone who hasn't prayed to accept Jesus into their heart for the forgiveness of their sins or chosen to let him lead their lives to pray with me, because this is something that you really don't want to put off. If God is pulling on your heart in any way, I would ask you to pray with me tonight. It's really like the most important decision you will ever make in your life, but you don't have to have all of the answers. I didn't have all of the answers. You just have to have faith. You have to believe that he is the God who made you, and he is the only one who can forgive you and make a way for you to heaven. If you want to pray with me right now, I just want to ask everybody to bow their heads. And you don't have to stand up or anything. I just want you to pray with me if you're ready to make this step forward in your life. It's really the best decision you can ever make. I'm so excited for you if you're about to make this decision. Heaven is going to rejoice. So just bow your heads and pray with me right now. Thank you so much. Heavenly Father, I believe that you are fully good and that my sin is what has separated me from you. Please forgive me for what I have done. I know that it is only through your Son, Jesus, that I can be forgiven and made whole. Lord, I give you my life. The steering wheel is now yours. Please lead me and help me to always follow you. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for loving me, God. I commit my heart to you today, too. It's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. Thank you so much. I think right now we're going to do a question and answer session. Do you want to talk about it?
Well, can we just give her a round of applause for